Alright, hello again. Jeff Scott of Blackhawk Technical College. I'll be coming at you right now with Chapter 17 for the 152 161 ASP.NET class from our Murox ASP.NET 4.5 web programming with C# 2012 text. Again, we're going to go over Chapter 17 now, and Chapter 17 talks about object data sources, and as mentioned right in the beginning, they're an alternative to SQL data sources. The idea behind object data sources is that you're not even necessarily tethered to using a database. All right, you'll see this as we go on in here. There are three applications in this chapter. There is a product list application, a product list maintenance application, and I don't remember what the other one is. I've got the product list one up right now. Okay, so about the same, a little bit longer than the previous chapter, but we'll go through it as best we can, as quickly as we can. So, first thing they talk about here, and you can see the picture that takes up the first half of page 553, and that's the three-layer architecture that's in ASP.NET. And the author mentions here, a best practice for web development is to use this three-layer architecture that separates the presentation, business rules, and data access components. Again, not all that different from model view controller type of architecture. Not really all that different from using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. The presentation layer, as they show on the top, includes the web pages that define the user interface. Alright, and again, kind of similar to the CSS. The middle layer includes the classes that manage the data access for those pages and may also include classes that implement the business rules. Alright, kind of like the controller. Kind of like JavaScript. Alright, the database layer consists of the database itself, kind of like the model. Alright, not exactly like HTML, but hopefully you get the idea. In this chapter, as the author mentions, you'll learn how to use object data sources. Alright, Microsoft uses the term business object classes and the term data object classes to refer to a class that provides data access for an object. In this chapter, the author uses the term data access class for this type. So if you look down towards the bottom here, here's an explanation of each layer. The presentation layer, again, on top here, as it says, it consists of the ASP.NET pages that manage the appearance of the application, including both the bound data controls and the object data source controls, which we'll talk about in this chapter. In the middle, you've got your middle layer, which again the author refers to as data access classes. And as he mentions, they manage the data access for the application. They can also contain business objects that represent business entities like customers, products, etc. Finally, you've got the database layer at the bottom, which consists of the database that contains the data for the application. Ideally, as mentioned there, the SQL statements that do this access are saved as stored procedures, so they're much more versatile, so that you're able to call them in different ways or call them with different inputs. As far as creating and working with a connection. Alright, so now we're just jumping into the object data source. So the author mentions on 554 to code the data access classes that you need for object data sources, you'll use ADO.NET. ADO is an acronym for ActiveX or Active Data Objects. Alright, the classes that you'll use are pretty much shown on this page here. Before you can access data in a database, you've got to create the connection object. We've looked at stuff like this before when we were working with the SQL data source. Alright, the two methods that are shown here, as you can tell, they allow you to open and close a connection to the database. In general, you leave the data connection open only while data is being retrieved or updated. Especially if it's a database that's going to be pounded on by a lot of people potentially at the same time. To execute an SQL statement against an SQL Server database, you create an SQL command object. These SQL command objects, or the object will contain the statement that you want to execute. The constructor for the object shown here accepts a string that contains the SQL statement to be executed along with the SQL connection object. Not really all that different from the stuff we looked at yesterday in the PHP class, where we had a data connection and then whatever we wanted to put in there for the query. To execute a command object, you use the two execute methods shown here. And it may not sound like a big thing, right? But execute non-query and execute reader, there is a difference between them. Notice execute non-query, that's used for inserts, updates, and deletes. The execute reader, and I believe I'm saying this right, I could have said it backwards, so I should really look in the book here. To execute an insert, update, or delete, you use the non-query method. All right, that's what I'd said. Yeah. This method returns an integer value with the number of rows that were affected by the command. So if you were doing multiple deletes or multiple updates, for example. And if you deleted a single row, it would return 1. Now with the execute reader method, as it says, it returns an SQL data reader object. So basically it's what you'd use with a select statement. All right. If the SQL statement you're executing includes parameters, you use the parameters property to work with the parameters of the object, and that's shown right here. We're going to see more examples as we go on. To work with the data reader that's returned by the execute reader, you use members of the SQL data reader class. Okay. So, jumping on, we're ahead in 558. The author shows here, it says, Figure 17.3 presents the basics of working with the Object Datastore. The image at the top shows how an Object Datastore that's bound to a drop-down list would appear in the system. Okay. In the first code example that you see down here, you can see that the drop-down list is bound to the Object Datasource using the Datasource ID. Okay. You'll use other attributes when you're working with insert, update, and deleting data. The second code example that you see down here shows the getAllCategories method of the ProductDB class. It uses ADO.NET code to retrieve category rows and return a data reader. So what you're noticing here, what you will notice is the more complex this stuff gets, the more code you'll have to create. There are still what's the word I'm looking for? Wizards and the like that you can use, but they're limited in scope, and the more that you want to do on your own and the more you want to customize, the more you'll have to add code. As far as configuring an object data source control, you can see here in the figure on page 559, you can use the configure data source dialog boxes to configure the control. The first one lets you choose the business object associated with a data source. The selection you make here will be specified in the type name attribute. All right. The drop-down list in the first dialog box will contain all the drop-down list there will contain all the data classes that are available in the opcode folder. In the second data source example, as you see right here, it lets you specify the methods that you want for insert, update, and delete operations. Later in this chapter, we'll talk about how those are used, but for now, the author just wants to concentrate on the object data source for retrieving data. All right. Although you can bind a data control, such as a drop-down list or a grid view, to an object data source, you can't always use the designer to select the individual fields. That's because the fields are defined in the data access class and not directly in the data source. Again, that's the reason that, as mentioned, you'll have to be adding more code. So what's shown on page 561, and I actually have it, but I didn't run it yet. Oh, I did run it, I guess. On the regular system, this is the product list application. All right, it's identical in appearance to the product list application we looked at in chapter 13, but now rather than using an SQL data source control to retrieve the data, it uses object data sources. It illustrates how to use object data sources and lets you separate the presentation code from the data access code. All of the presentation code is in the ASPX file, and all of the data access code is in the data access class that's called ProductDB. So you'll notice, again, this is one we've looked at earlier. So as I change the category, the associated data changes as well. So the ASPX file is shown here on page 563. If you compare the listing with the one that's in 1317 back several pages and several chapters ago, the author says here, you'll notice that the only difference is that the SQL data source elements have been replaced by object data source elements. In other words, the code for the drop-down list and the data list is identical, whether you use an SQL data source or an object data source. In the first object data source control, the type name attribute specifies product ID, ProductDB, and the select method attribute specifies get all categories. The result of this is that the get all categories method in the product DB data access class is called to retrieve the category data when the drop-down list is bound. Because the data binding is defined entirely in the ASPX file, there's no code behind for this particular page. As a result, the only C# is for the product DB class, which we'll look at in the next figure. And so that's on page 565. To create this class, the author used website, add new item, and the class category. And you can see you get your things that are provided for you by default, your using statements. All right. And the author says he wants to point out that the data object and the data object methods that appear in the class. Says these attributes are used to identify the class and methods as data objects, and you'll learn how to use them a little later on. For now it says realize they're used by the configure data source wizard to determine which classes and methods to display. The get all categories method starts by creating a connection to the Halloween database. Then an SQL command object is created using a string variable that contains a select statement and the connection object as its parameters. After the connection is opened, the execute reader method is called to create a data reader object. All right, and the data reader is returned to the object data source. The get products by category is a little bit more complicated because it uses a parameter, and you can see it right here. Again, the advantage of using parameters in this stuff is the stuff can be determined then at runtime as far as what you're looking for. Okay, as far as creating an actual data access class as shown here on page 567 in the book, the author mentions on 566 that the most challenging aspect here when you're working with this stuff is developing the data access classes that are going to be required. So the topics that follow explain how to design and implement these types of classes. All right, the data access class used by an object data source can have 4 different types of methods. One for select, one for insert, one for update, and one for delete. You can use any method names you want, and you can design the class so that it has more than one of each type of method, so more than one select, more than one insert, etc., if or as needed. The data access methods can be static or instance methods. If they're defined as instance methods, the object data source control will create an instance of the class before it calls the method, then destroy it after the method has been executed. All right. The other thing that's mentioned in here, and the author talks about it a little, I have looked at it, I sort of understand it, but I'm not going to try to snow you with details. But the author mentions in the bottom paragraph on 566, the author says, in case you haven't encountered reflection before, it's a .NET feature that provides information about compiled classes at runtime. For example, reflection can determine which methods are provided for a particular class. In addition, it can determine which parameters each method requires and the type returned by each method. So it's pretty powerful stuff. And since it's figured out at runtime, it's customizable. So in other words, when you run the program, you can provide different information each time you run it. As far as creating the select method, that's shown in here, and as it says, figure 17.9, which is this one, shows how to design, code, and create a select method used with an object data source. The table at the top has the 4 different types of values that the select can return. The simplest is an IE enumerable interface, which returns a data reader or a data view, since the data reader and data view classes implement the IE enumerable interface. It can also return a data table or data set object. A data set can contain more than one table. So here the object data source control simply uses the first table in the set. The main advantage of returning a data set is that the object data source can cache it. And if you want to cache it, you have to enable or set the enable caching attribute to true. You can also pass parameters to a select method. If you do that, the object data source control must include a select parameters element. Some of that stuff is shown in here. Again, this is about as heavy in this class, at least, as it would get. So that's the insert. For the update, delete, that's for the select. And for the insert, update, and delete, that is discussed on pages 570 and 571. It says, besides select method, the data access can create, update, delete, and inserts to the underlying database. Before you code these, you need to determine what parameters are required. The figure summarizes how an object Datasource generates these parameters. Any insert or delete requires a single business object as parameter. If an update method provides for optimistic concurrency, it requires two parameters. All right, one is the parameters for the business object, and the other one must be the business object that provides the original values, and the other must be the business object that provides the new values. All right, so you can, make sure. And plus, with concurrency, you want to be able to roll back if somebody else is changing at the same time you're changing. The business objects that you use to pass update, delete, and insert methods are defined by the class defined on the data object type name attribute for the data source. The class must provide a parameterless constructor. The class must also provide a public property for each bound field passed from the bound control to the object data source. Okay? The property for each bound field must include both get and set accessors, and you don't have to use business objects as the parameters for insert, update, delete methods. Rather, if you want, you can use a parameter for each bound field that's required by a method. Next, on 573, they talk about how to use attributes to mark a data access class. And as mentioned there and shown on page 573, the author says you can use C# attributes to identify a data access class and its methods. If you haven't worked with attributes before, they're simply a way to provide declarative information for classes, methods, properties, etc. Starting on page 574 and 575 in the book, now the first one was that category application, but they also have, you have the category maintenance application, so I can stop the run on this. Close the solution, not saving. I'm going to have all this stuff out there for you, and it's in a folder with, it's entitled 1105-2014. So the second one is the product list page. I believe this is the one. Let's see. No, category maintenance, sorry. So this should give us the same code that you see on page 5, or the same interface that you see on page 575 of the book. And there it is. So, to give you a better idea how to use an object data source to update, delete, and insert data, the following topics present an application that maintains the categories table in the Halloween database. It's a variation of the category maintenance app presented in Chapter 14. This shows the design right here of the category maintenance app. It uses a grid view to let the user update or delete categories, and a details view to insert new category rows. Both the grid view and details view are bound to a single object data source, but the detail view is used only for insert, so it isn't used to display, update, or delete. All right. The ASPX is shown on pages 576 and 577. In the first part there on page 576, you see the ASPX code for the grid view that displays the category rows. On the next page, you see the ASPX code for the object data source. All right, parameters are included only for the update method right here. As far as the code behind, which is on pages 578 and then shown on page 579, the file consists of 5 methods that handle the exceptions that might be raised and the possible concurrency errors or problems that might occur when the data sources update, delete, or inserts are called. The first method is executed after the data source is updated. It retrieves the return value from the update method using the return value property of the E argument and assigns it to the affected row property of the E argument. The second method is executed after a row in the grid view control is updated, and that happens after the data source has been updated. The next two methods are similar, except they handle the deleted event of the object data source control and the row deleted event of the control. Finally, the last method is executed after a row is inserted using the details view control. And again, the stuff that's in here is very similar to stuff we've seen in the past, where we check to see if there has been any kind of exception, and if an exception has occurred, You want to mention what it is and basically get out. And you also want to check for concurrency types of problems. So if affected row equals 0, that usually means that somebody else has been trying to update the record at the same time as you, so it didn't work. All right. The category class for this is shown on page 581. The class contains 3 public properties that correspond to the 3 columns of the categories table, those being category ID, short name, and long name. The values of these properties are stored in 3 private data fields declared in the class. As required for business classes that are used in an object data source, each property is defined with both a get and a set. The class also includes a parameterless constructor called when the object data source creates an instance of the class. Right, so there's the parameterless constructor. It's really not doing much. There's the get set for category ID, the get set for short name, and the get set for long name. As far as the actual category DB class on 582 and 583, and also on 584 and 585, the 2 parts of this figure show the category DB class used as the data access for the application. The class uses data object and data object method attributes to mark the class as a data object and to mark the methods as data object methods. The 4 methods provide the select, insert, update, and delete. The get categories method retrieves all of the rows and columns from the categories table. The only difference between this method and the method shown previously and back in figure 17.9 is that the connection and command objects are created with using statements. The author mentions before he goes on, you should realize that if you run the app that uses an object data source with debugging and an unhandled exception occurs, Visual Studio enters break mode. When the user clicks the delete button, in this case the object data source executes the delete category. The method also accepts a single parameter for the category object. Again, as mentioned to you previously, the idea behind this is just very quickly, which is all I've been doing, just giving you a little bit of an introduction to this. All right. How to use paging and sorting with object data sources. When you use an object data source, it doesn't automatically provide paging and sorting like the grid view did. Because of that, you have to set attributes of the object data source that provide for paging and sorting. To create an object data source that provides for paging and sorting, you set the elements that are shown here, first 4 elements that are shown right here in the table that's on page 587. When set to true, the enable paging attributes enables paging, which you'd probably guess. The start row index parameter and maximum rows parameter name attributes specify the names of the parameters used by the select method in the data access class to determine which rows are going to be returned by the method. The select count, the 4th one there, names a method in the data access class that returns a count of the total number of rows returned by the select method. Finally, the sorted parameter name, the last attribute here, provides the name of the parameter in the select method that's used to sort the actual data. Next, the author shows the ASPX file that provides for paging and sorting on page 589. The grid view control that's shown here includes a sort expression attribute for its product name or product ID name and category columns, which are the ones that we provided sorting for before. All right. Next, we'll take a look starting on the bottom of page 589 and shown more on page 591 in the book. The author will show you the actual code behind file that provides for the sorting. And he mentions here, in many cases, the select method associated with an object data source will return the data in a sorted sequence. For example, the data that's retrieved by the getProducts method of productDB that's used by the object data source sorts the data by name in ascending sequence. Finally, as far as creating a data access class that provides paging and sorting, that's what's shown here on page 591. The class includes 3 methods. All right, there's getProduct, which is a select method that returns the products for the requested page. Load product list isn't shown here. It uses standard ADO.NET code to get all the products from the database and store them in a list product object. And the first time the select method is called, no value is passed to the sort order. Because of that, the statement in the default label is executed, which sorts the product name in ascending sequence. That's pretty much it then. So we've gone through the first 17 chapters in this book. So this chapter we talked about object data sources for building three-layer web applications. Okay? We talked about what a three-layered web application was. All right, we talked about the presentation layer, the business layer, the database layer, etc. All right, again, I'm not going to go over anything from section 4 in this book, as I'd already mentioned to you. So I'm not going to go over chapter 18 on the secure connection for the application, chapter 19 which is authentication and authorization. So really sorry, but you're not really getting any security in this book. Chapter 20 on email and custom error pages I'm not going to cover, nor am I covering chapter 21 on configuring and deploying an application. But in section 5, bringing your stuff to the next level, I am going to cover again one chapter in there. I will not cover chapter 22, which shows how to use ASP.NET AJAX. I will not cover chapter 23, which is on WCF and Windows API services, but I will be covering chapter 24, which is an introduction to ASP.NET Model View Controller. The way that I'm going to do that, if you care, what I plan on doing is when I come in here tomorrow morning, I plan on giving a lecture, hopefully a fairly detailed lecture with all the stuff from chapter 24 here. Then I'm going to give the same kind of lecture in class next week. All right, and the way that this will work for the rest of the semester, just so you know this, all right, I'm not trying to waste my time or your time, hopefully somebody's watching this tape, but just so you know what's going to be going on for the rest of the semester. All right, it's just, there we go, semester schedule final. All right, so again, this has been a little bit different. 11.3, go over the homework. We did that. 11.10, so that'll be next Tuesday, chapter 24. And for the rest of the semester, so weeks 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. All right, the way that we'll work each of these weeks, so this will be week 11, of 11-17, and the way that I'm going to work this is Tuesday lecture, Thursday lab. We will be going over a project as a class, and I am expecting that you're going to key that project in. If not along with me, that you'll go back and do it on your own. We won't meet, of course, this week. We'll only meet on the Tuesday. So 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why is this wrong? And it is. Oh, because I've got 12 in there twice. Okay. So 13, 14, 15, 16. Let's just get rid of that one. And 17. All right, so when we get to here, it'll be week 12-1. And here it will be week 12-8. And during the week of the 24th, Tuesday lecture, Thursday, no class. That will be the last one. And again, I've moved the date for the second homework assignment to 11/26/2014. All right, and we'll put in here project MVC project due date, and that will be literally the last day of class. Set at 12/10/2014. Okay? If you have any questions on this, it's your responsibility to get a hold of me and let me know. So this is now the final as of 11/05/2014. So that'll be saved as final V2. That's all that I've got.